Reading from Genesis 18, starting at verse 16. When the men got up to leave, they looked down toward Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. Then the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised to him."
Then the Lord said, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grievous that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know." The men turned away and went toward Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Then Abraham approached him and said, "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right?" The Lord said, "If I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I'll spare the whole place for their sake." Then Abraham, quite funny in my opinion, spoke up again. "Well, now that I've been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I'm nothing but dust and ashes, what if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5 people? If I find 45 there," he said, "I will not destroy it." Once again he spoke to him, "What if only 40 are found there?" He said, "For the sake of 40, I will not do it." Then he said, "May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak. What if only 30 can be found there?" He answered, "I will not do it if I find 30 there." Abraham said, now that I've been so bold as to speak to the Lord, what if only 20 can be found there? For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it." Then he said, "May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found?" He answered, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left, and Abraham returned home.
I remember a disagreement I had with my father. The disagreement was about the difference between kilograms and pounds. Because as you may or may not know, one is a measure of mass and the other is a measure of weight. And there's a difference between a measure of mass and weight. Some of you, people that were into science and things like that. Mass stays constant, whereas weight changes. Mass is how much stuff there is, but weight is actually the force of gravity on it. And so if you go to the moon, your mass will remain the same, but you will say that you weigh a different amount because of the gravity of the moon. Well, my dad would have none of that. It was all weight, and so we had a disagreement about that. I just remember about how annoyed I was that he wouldn't, that he couldn't accept what I was just learning in school then about mass and weight. So, ever had a disagreement with a parent? Some guilty nods in there, yes. Well, there is something called the Mishnah, and it was an ancient commentary written by rabbis, and they contain an interesting story about a disagreement between Abraham and his father, Terah. Now, it springs really from a text in Joshua that says, "Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods." One version of that story in the Mishnah, and there's various versions of this kind of a story about Abraham, it's that Terah not only worshipped idols, but was actually an idol maker. And one day when Abraham was at the workshop while his father was away, an older woman came to the shop carrying a bowl of fine flour to give to the idols as an offering. Well, when she had left, Abraham took a stick and he broke all of the idols, placed the stick in the hand of the one remaining idol, the largest one, and when Terah, Abraham's father, returned to the shop, he asked his son, "Who did this to the gods?" And Abraham told his father Terah about the woman who had brought this flour for an offering, and he said, "When I offered the flour, one god said, 'I will eat first,' and another god yelled, 'No, I'll eat first.'" Abraham then described the argument that ensued until the largest of the idols became angry and took a stick and broke all the other idols to pieces. And Terah replied, "Idols don't get hungry. Idols don't speak. Idols don't break each other. They're simply idols." And Abraham smiled and said, "Oh, Father, if only your ears could hear what your mouth is saying. Why then do you worship them?" Interesting. Now, we don't know when or how Abraham may have disagreed with his father Terah about idol worship, but we are told at the end of Genesis chapter 11 that part of the family moved from Ur to a place called Haran, after one of Terah's sons, also named Haran. It's really confusing in the end of chapter 11 because there's Haran and Haran. NIV puts 2 R's in one of them, but it's the same word in the original. And one of the sons had died in Ur. Terah moved to Haran, taking his orphan grandson, Lot, and Abraham and Sarah, and it was there in Haran that Terah died. Now, this little introduction about Abraham at the end of Genesis 11, it both contains and conceals quite a bit about this family and some of the stuff and the turmoil and the tension. I want to pick up the story in Genesis 12. The Lord had said to Abraham, I'm going to get this mixed up because I always say Abraham, but earlier was Abram and his name was changed. God had said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. And I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you." So Abraham went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, later become Sarah, Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. So there are 2 important details that come out in this story, one in the introduction and another one here in this. One in the introduction, we're told that Abraham and Sarai had no children. And if you read it in the NASB, it's actually interesting. It says, Sarah was barren and had no children. Isn't that a little redundant? But that redundant wording was actually the equivalent of using a bold font or underlining something, was drawing attention to that, because that painful fact became an essential part of their story. So, he had no children, but he was very wealthy. Notice it says he took the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired. Interesting wording there, culture of the day. That would have included hired workers, probably slaves. And the wording suggests that his size and wealth grew significantly in Haran. When you get to Genesis 14, we discover that Abraham's household included 318 men who were trained for war. The snapshot we have is that he had great wealth, but no child. God tells him to move, and so he does. In ancient cultures, your social standing, your importance, your worth resided in 2 things, the wealth and the size of your family. So Abraham had a very interesting status. You see, he was simultaneously very wealthy and very poor. Very wealthy and very poor. And that's when Abraham met God. Not the many gods that his father had worshipped or maybe made idols for, but the one true God. That's how Abraham's journey begins. So why did he follow God's instruction to move to this undetermined place that God said, the place I will tell you? Well, he had encountered a God who he thought perhaps could give him the one thing that he desperately wanted, but could not attain on his own. He wanted a family. His father's gods could not give him a family, but this God promised a family larger than anything he could imagine. So at this point, we don't know if he followed out of faith or desperation, but that promise of a large family, it unfolds through the story of Abraham. And through that story, God grows larger. But it takes a painful amount of time. Years and decades pass without a child. The promise is repeated and reiterated and sealed with a covenant. But still nothing. Just a quick look at some of those. We saw that in 12 verse 2. I'll make you a great nation. I'll bless you. I'll make your name great. You will be a blessing. In 15, your heir will not be a servant from your house, but your own son. Your offsprings will be too numerous to count. In chapter 17, his name was changed from Abram to Abraham. Again, it's easier for me to say now. You'll be the father of many nations. 17, verse 16 through 19. Sarah's name is changed from Sarai to Sarah. And it says, Sarah will bear you a son, and you will name him Isaac. And then we get to chapter 18, which is the chapter that we read from. And we didn't read the first part of the chapter. But what happens in that first part of the chapter is that the Lord and three men show up, and they tell Abraham and Sarah, a year from now, you will have your son. Now, near the center of that section in Genesis 18, and if you're watching online and you didn't read through Genesis 18, just pause, read through Genesis 18, have it in your Bibles or your device if you're here, and we're going to be looking particularly at that. Near the center of that whole account, which is sort of at the center of the Abraham account, God seems slow in fulfilling his promises. Abraham's called to trust regardless. And at the center of that, there's a curious passage of verse I have always found very interesting. Now, years ago, I was alerted to this verse. Decades. About 45 or so years ago, I read a book called Daring to Draw Near. We did a Bible study on this actually in the early COVID years. And I don't know where my book went. I was looking for it on my shelf, and it's gone, so it's who knows where that is. But in that book, is written by a psychologist named John White. The book was called Daring to Draw Near. Contained commentary and meditation on passages where people in the Bible encountered God. And that book, it was sort of part of my journey, teaching us that prayer is more than just a ritual or a request. It's a journey of knowing God. Abraham's journey of knowing God reaches a critical point in Genesis 18. In that curious bargaining passage that we read, that always amuses me with Matthias on that. It's just like this is quite the debate between them. When Abraham bargains with God about the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah, to the two infamous cities that were destroyed by God because of their wickedness. And the verse that captures my attention is verse 18, or verse 25 of chapter 18. Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? So as I've looked at that verse and thought about it and read it many, many times over the past decades, I always ask myself this question. Is this a question? Or is it a conclusion? We see both through his journey. And maybe it was both, or maybe it was neither, depending on Abram's emotions or at that time. And through the ages, many continue to ask that question. They don't word it quite that way. But they'll word it in things like, I can't believe in a God who would torment people for eternity. Or I can't believe in a God that allows countless people to suffer in natural disasters or sit on the sidelines while people kill each other in horrendous ways. Why does God let evil people prosper? Why doesn't God answer my prayers, even after I've done my best to follow him, obey his instructions? These questions are really different ways of asking that same thing. What is God like? Is he at heart vindictive or cruel or stingy or demanding? Or, in short, can he be trusted? What kind of God is he? Many people wrestle with that. Some never come to a resolution. Some embrace faith and have high confidence in God and God's future for them in eternity. Yet there's a lot of ache about what's playing out in there now, in the time right now. Why doesn't God show up and answer me when I'm praying about the problems that have been nagging me for years or decades? Does he hear my prayers? Does he even care? And beyond personal troubles, you look at the world, and what about evil and injustice and poverty? And your heart breaks and you ask God, where are you in all of this mess? It doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem fair. What kind of God are you? Or maybe you have been challenged a little bit because you've gotten to know someone. You've met someone who doesn't share your faith. Maybe they don't believe in God at all. Or maybe they follow a completely different religion. And as you get to know them, they're incredibly kind and honest and warm and generous. They seem more Christian than many who claim to be Christians. And you have this nagging question, well, what's going to happen with them? They've never had a chance. They've never had the opportunity to place their faith in Jesus. And those are all excellent questions. They're echoed in Abraham's emotions here in chapter 18, but even more than that, through the entire story. So let's look at those emotions. Look at some of these questions and what you might even call it skepticism that they have. In Genesis 15, when that promise was reiterated and sealed with a covenant, God tells them, and this is going to happen, and it says, but Abraham said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless and the one who will inherit my state, Eliezer of Damascus? And Abraham said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Like, God, how are you going to do this? It's not working. Then we get to chapter 17, and again, the Lord appears to Abraham and tells him that you're going to have a child. No timeline yet, but you're going to have a child. And this is already probably a decade, 15 years, maybe even more, which would stretch into 24 years of waiting. Abraham fell face down when God told him, and he said he laughed. Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Or Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abraham said to God, oh, if only Ishmael may live under your blessing. We'll mention that briefly just a little later. So at the outset of Genesis 18, as I mentioned, these three men show up at Abraham and Sarah's place. They scramble to prepare a meal, and then they're told that by this time next year, they will have a son. And Sarah isn't in on the conversation. She's listening at the side of the tent, and she starts laughing. Sarah laughed, verse 18, verse 15. I'm worn out, and Abraham's old, and now will I have this pleasure? And then one of the men asks, why did Sarah laugh? And is anything too hard for the Lord? And Sarah was afraid, so she lied, and she said, no, I didn't laugh. So this embarrassing situation that the fellow just said, you did laugh. Just, you imagine the silence there. You just, yeah. So that's some of the questions. But consider what Abraham was feeling through this almost 25 years. Some of the complications. Early on in chapter 13, we see that Lot and Abraham separate. I related earlier how Abraham left his family, first from the Ur and then in Haran. But his connection to flesh and blood family became even a little thinner when he separated from Lot. You're probably familiar with the story. Abraham and Lot had a rich people problem. They had nowhere to park their growing fleet of RVs. They had just too much stuff. No, it wasn't RVs, but all their flocks, all their herds. They couldn't coexist in the same space. The herdsmen began quarreling. So they went to this high place where they could see in all directions, and Abraham said, well, maybe we should split up. You choose one area, and I'll go the other direction. And it seems to me at that point that the expected response of Lot should have been, well, I think that's a good idea. But you should choose, because you're older. You're my uncle. But there is no bartering, as you see in the Genesis 18 story, or you see the story when Abraham's trying to get some land to bury Sarah. They're always bargaining. There's no bargaining here. Lot just quickly claims the lush, well-watered plain of the Jordan, scrambles off. So they parted ways. Abraham was wealthy in possessions, but poor in family. And now he felt even poorer. Nephew Lot had disrespected him, now lived further away. He was poor. Lot had moved, geographically, probably also emotionally. Interestingly, though, we have chapter 14, and Abraham becomes a local hero to the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. There's another twist. A group of kings attacks Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot His possessions, his family, and others in the town are carried away. Abraham hears word of this. He takes 318 of his trained men and pursues the invading army, they say about 350 kilometers worth. He rescues Lot along with all the possessions, all the other people, and brings them back to town. He becomes this well-known person, this hero. He knew their names. He had traveled with them on the way back to Sodom and Gomorrah. He got to know the kids that were on that had been taken. Everyone took time to thank him when he returned to town. They probably had a big party and a big celebration. The king of Sodom even tried to reward Abraham, but he wouldn't accept any reward. So we have this rich man who is very poor. Or was it a poor man who was very rich? I'm not sure which. He suddenly became very famous. But this promise of having a child wasn't happening, so they took matters into their own hands. Oh, I think I went too. And Abraham has a child named Ishmael through Sarai's slave Hagar. I'm not going to go into details of that story. That's a whole other message, a whole other sermon there. But it's obvious that this unfulfilled promise and now this child Ishmael is an incredible source of tension in that family. So there's conflicting emotions. We finally get to 18, the chapter that we're reading about. The three men appear. They predict that the son would be born within a year, and there's this awkward, embarrassed laughter that's happening. By this time, both Abraham and Sarah kind of thought this was impossible. Sarah can't contain herself. Then the men leave for Sodom. And the Lord says, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do?" It's a curious verse where God's talking to himself. Should I hide from Abraham? Is it really a good idea to let Abraham in on these plans to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? How would he react to the prospect of Lot, the only close relations that he had, being destroyed in that? Especially when they were still waiting for the promise of the family of their own. So in verse 20 to 23, the Lord shares about the coming destruction. And Abraham questions the Lord, "Will you really sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous?" "No, I won't destroy it if there's 50 there. But what about 45? What about, I think there's 40 in there as well, and 30 and 20 and 10. So as I've read this through the years, I've always asked the question, why did he start at 50? Why did he end at 10? Did he sort of mentally count the people that he knew and came up with a number? And then, yeah, maybe at least there should be that many. That should be safe. And then when the Lord said no, then he started to just go off the list and maybe reduced it to some that he knew in immediate family and a few more. There's got to be at least 10. Well, we don't know exactly how he picked that number. I think maybe he thought that with that, maybe at least his family would be safe. Maybe he presumed that there would be a good outcome. He may have, or maybe through this whole process, he'd gained enough trust in God, regardless of the outcome. We don't know what was going through his head, but we do know that things continue and the calamity takes place. You get the story of the destruction of the city. And then at the end of chapter 19, you get the story, in chapter 19, you get the story of the destruction of Sodom, and you get the story of Lot. That's another one that I'm not going to go into on Sunday morning. It's development of the nation of the Moabites. Abraham gets up the next day. Verse 27. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and returned to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. And his stomach twisted in anguish. The family, as little as it was, probably had grown smaller. We're not told how or when Abraham knew that Lot had escaped. But somehow, even when everything seemed hopeless, God was still at work. And this question haunted him. Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? And as you watch that smoke, that question met him at the lowest emotional point in his life. Interestingly, Lot's story continued. The wording of the NAS is really interesting. Then it came about, after it tells the story of Lot and his daughters and development of the Moabite nation, it came about when God destroyed the cities of the valley, that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot in the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot lived. Something about that calamity and the overthrow in there. Lot's family continues despite, throughout Lot's life it seems, and his family, some very questionable choices. Isn't that ironic? Abraham doesn't yet have a child. And now, both Lot's daughters have a child. We don't know when or how Abraham ever discovered that, but wouldn't that be just a little hard to take? Another little tidbit that's in the story of Abraham is, you know, those couple of stories where Abraham travels to another place. At one point he travels to Egypt because there's a famine. But he's not sure whether he was going to be accepted or he was going to be attacked because of all his wealth and his beautiful wife Sarah, so he lies and says, she's my sister. That happens early on in the story. And then in chapter 20, after, and this is in the text, it's immediately after the smoldering city and he sees the smoke, he goes to this place called Gerar. And again, he does the same thing and says, she is my sister. And so the king of that place, Abimelech, he takes Sarah into his group. We're not told details, but we can imagine what might happen, what might be about to happen. But the Lord speaks to Abimelech and lets Abimelech know that that's actually Abraham's wife. And you're in big trouble, because if you would have touched her, you would have been in huge, huge trouble. Interesting little story. And in that time, do you ever notice what Abimelech's question is to the Lord? Because he realizes that he is in trouble. And he says, Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? Will not the judge of all the earth do right? Doesn't it sound kind of familiar? What kind of God are you? And then to add more irony on this yet, Abimelech's barren household is healed through Abraham's prayer. God protects Abraham, generously showers him with undeserved gifts of silver and livestock and land, like he didn't have enough already, but Abimelech gives him some more. And in an ironic twist in verse 17 and 18, then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female slaves so they could have children again, for the Lord had kept all the women in Abimelech's household from conceiving because of Abraham's wife Sarah. How often over the past 24 years had he prayed for his own wife? Had he prayed that they would have children? Now he's in this place where he describes as saying, there's no fear of God in this place. And behold, Abimelech's wife and female slaves are healed. By his prayer, no less. Isn't that ironic? Isn't that something really, really odd? Will not the judge of all the earth do right? Well, In case you've never read any of the story or not, you're aware of all the 16.5 million Jewish people in the world today. They had a son named Isaac, right? And it's hard to keep suspense in that when you've read the story. And of those, many live in Israel, a lot in the United States. The next country of about 16.5 million is 450,000 or so in France, and just about 400,000 in Canada. We're the fourth in the number of Jewish people within the world. So why do I bring all of this together and bring all these emotions together? It's very interesting. There's a little phrase in 15:6, Genesis 15:6, where it says, Abraham believed God, and he credited to him as righteousness. And that little phrase echoes through the New Testament in various places. But it echoes, and suddenly, near one of the books towards the end of the New Testament, there's a new note that rings that I think gives us some insight. Romans 4:3, what does Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Galatians 3:6, so Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And then James 2:23, and the Scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And, you know what it says? He was called God's friend. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? Is that a question or a conclusion? Both? Neither? Could it be that this man who was simultaneously rich and poor was expressing in that both a question or doubt and confidence? I've called this message When God Grows Larger. Maybe what we discover in this is that God grew larger when he became smaller. God grew larger when he became smaller. What do I mean by that? God continued to make himself known to Abraham, even in the confusing and confining circumstances of his life. He continued to do so, protecting and blessing Abraham even when he didn't deserve it. And even in the wickedness that resulted in the devastating destruction, God continued to send rain and blessing on the righteous and the unrighteous. So over the course of this journey, Abraham's experience of God grew. And the way he knew him changed. From a judge to a friend. Somehow, through this whole complicated journey, Abraham had learned God is not against us. He is for us. And that's the message of the incarnation. God becoming larger by becoming smaller. About 2,000 years after Abraham, the Apostle Paul writes this. What shall we say then in response to these things? If God is for us, who could be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also along with him graciously give us all things? Will not the judge of all the earth do right? Have you discovered God as a friend? Or do you still know him most as a judge? 2,000 years after the Apostle Paul, God continues to grow larger as Jesus continues to meet us in the confusing and confining circumstances of our own world. So a couple of weeks ago, I asked you about your journey. I want to ask that question again, and this week in your email will be a link that you can take a look at that sheet again if you don't have a sheet of paper that was handed out. And we'd love to hear about how in your world God has grown larger. We're going to give some time for that either on Communion Sunday, the 20th of September, or Thanksgiving Sunday, the 11th of October, or maybe some of both of those. Let me know if you've been thinking about that, and we'd love to have you share in 5 minutes or less. And there's a sheet here you can look at, or I also suggested, think of your life in decades and say, what are the spiritual experiences of my life in each of those decades? And pick one or two of those experiences and share with us. I think it would be so encouraging. I've had one person already that's said, here's some stuff I'm ready to share. And that's great, and I'm looking forward to hearing that. When God grows larger, how has God grown larger in your life?